A warm welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm Gloria Duffy, as many of you know, President and CEO of the club, and I'm delighted to be hosting the conversation with Dr. McFaul tonight. So joining us this evening is former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. He is a longtime scholar of Russia and the other former Soviet states. He studied at Stanford and then at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He was deeply committed to bringing about democratic change in the Soviet Union as it crumbled in the early 1990s. He worked with the U.S. National Democratic Institute and democratic parties and groups in Russia on election strategy and political reform during the time when it seemed possible that Russia would become a more democratic society. He was recruited to be a member of candidate Obama's Foreign Policy Advisory Committee for the 2008 campaign. And when Mr. Obama became president, Ambassador McFaul was asked to join the National Security Council staff as the senior director responsible for advising the president on Russia policy. He served in that role from 2009 to 2011. At the end of 2011, President Obama nominated him as U.S. ambassador to Russia, and the Senate approved him by unanimous consent. That would be quite
doesn't happen much these
unusual these days. I even stumbled over those words, unanimous consent. He served as our ambassador to Moscow from 2012 to 2014 during what became an increasingly challenging period in U.S.-Russian relations. Dr. McFaul has written numerous scholarly books and articles. In his first book that's been oriented to a more general audience, From Cold War to Hot Peace, An American Ambassador in Putin's Russia, Ambassador McFaul discusses the history of American-Russian relations since the Cold War, including his role in the well-known reset policy that initially succeeded in renewed cooperation between the two countries until the crumbling of relations upon Vladimir Putin's return to the presidency in 2012. Ambassador McFaul is currently professor of political science at Stanford University, director of Stanford's well-known Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, a contributor for NBC News and MSNBC, where you see him frequently interpreting international events.
I was actually supposed to be there tonight. I'm with you instead.
And we deeply appreciate that. Thank you, Mike. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome to Ambassador Mike McFaul, who is back at the Commonwealth Club after several previous appearances. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be back. I've never been in this building. What a fantastic building. Thank you, Gloria, for what you've done to make this happen. So,
thank you, Mike.
Yes.
So let's start at the beginning. You came from Montana. You're the son of a father who is a musician and music teacher and a mother who has been a university administrator. How did you come to be interested in Russia?
So it did start in Montana. It happened with a move from a B to B town. For most of you, it will be meaningless. But in my junior year, we moved from Butte to Bozeman. And that changed my life. Because most of my life, I was born in a town called Glasgow, even more obscure, although there's a lot of ICBMs up there. You may know that area. Well, I didn't know that at the time when I was growing up. But Butte's a pretty rough mining town, not a very intellectual place. I love Butte, by the way, if there's anybody from Butte here. And I've learned to love Butte more and more as I've learned the history of that great town. But we moved in my junior year, and I wasn't very academically oriented, to be honest. I didn't like to write. Now I've written a 500-page book, but most of them are 50 pages of footnotes, so don't be afraid. Buy the book. And I took debate class to try to get an easy A. My neighbor told me, if this is the way to get an easy A in English, take debate class. And the year that I took debate and then later joined the debate team, the topic was how to improve U.S. trade policy. And my partner and I ran a case, you may remember this ancient history, to repeal the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the 1974 Trade Act as a way to increase trade to the Soviet Union. By the way, later I became a staunch supporter of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and was quite involved in refuseniks and bringing things to Jewish people that were refused immigration to Israel and the United States. But back then, that was our case. By the way, my debate partner is now Senator Steve Daines from Montana, so we were pretty good. But that was the spark, and so that's when I got interested in the Soviet Union. I got to Stanford as a 17-year-old kid, and this was in the height of the early years of Ronald Reagan, and it was a scary time for me. And I had a kind of simple theory from my time in Montana that if we could just get to know these people better, to understand them, we could reduce tension. So freshman year at Stanford, I enrolled in Poli-Sci 35 with Professor Steve Krasner, who still teaches at Stanford to this day, and first year Russian. And that was the early spark. And then 2 years later, I took my first trip abroad, not to Paris, not to London, but to Leningrad, USSR. Imagine my mother's reaction to that in Montana. You know, she thought that California was a communist country back then. And she worried that I was going to come here and, you know, grow my hair long and all these hippies. And my hair did get a lot longer after a couple of years in Stanford. And then I called her up to say, I'm going to, back then, the president referred to it as the evil empire. But that was the beginnings of my spark and my interest.
Mm-hmm. You've had a real commitment to democratic change. You mentioned the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and how it tried to leverage human rights in the Soviet Union. But all along, your work with the democracy movement and then raising issues in your various official capacities and so on, how did that arise? Where did that come from in your background?
So about 2 years later from where we're at in the story. So 83, I go to Leningrad. And I sometimes hesitate to say this because I'm worried about some future confirmation hearings. But I came back thinking that there was much ado about nothing, all this Cold War stuff. These people didn't seem scary to me. They weren't 8 feet tall. They weren't all brilliant. I met people like me, you know, college kids that like to listen to Led Zeppelin, you know, and it's like, well we're really going to go to war with these people? And so that's the summer of 83. I go back to Moscow in 1985, not my first trip abroad, not summer, you know, not white nights in Leningrad, which is a fantastic time to go to St. Petersburg if you ever get the chance. But now it's January in Moscow. It's freezing. Another little footnote I need to add, so you have the full flavor of it. My then girlfriend was living in Italy because she's a lot smarter than me. Now she's my wife. So that all worked out. So that played a role too. But the more important thing was I learned Russian better. I was in 4th year Russian, so I got deeper into the fabric of Soviet society. And I met the black marketeers and those folks, but that's when I really met some of the refusnik community. That's when I met some dissidents. And that's when I also met some very privileged children at Moscow State University who were privileged because their parents were in the Communist Party. So that's when I began to think about, this dictatorship is not fair. But there's another event that has nothing to do with Russia right around that time. In 1985, I spent the summer in Nigeria, Africa, and came back to Stanford and got very involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And that probably was the more formative experience thinking about South Africa. And then that later, as you said earlier in your introduction, back in 1985, the notion that the Soviet Union was going to democratize, that was a pretty radical idea. I was a student in the Soviet Union when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, but when things started to change later, 87, 88, 89, that's when I pivoted back away from Africa and thinking about the possibility of change in the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. So you advised President Bush you worked for President Obama. How have you been able to keep the lines of communication open to people, leaders of all political persuasions?
Yeah.
You've been able to balance work for both parties, and you're not easy to classify politically.
Yeah. Well, let me reveal some secrets. These are tough questions. This is good.
Because I know you
yes.
a little bit.
Well, first of all, I think there's a big misconception about foreign policy debates generally. I teach a class on American foreign policy at Stanford, and one of the first lectures I give is to code different schools of thought, liberalism and realism that you would know well, and they don't fit neatly in the Democrat and Republican parties. There are isolationists in the Democratic Party, there are isolationists in the Republican Party. There are people that believe in realpolitik in the Democratic Party, and they're in the Republican Party. And there are what we would call in the Democratic Party Wilsonian liberals. If you're in the Republican Party, I don't know what they call themselves anymore. They used to be called neocons. Mm-hmm. Now I think they're just really, really upset Republicans because they don't really like the President Trump. And I know a lot of these people. So that's the first thing. And I do, whenever I talk these days, I like to remind people that when it comes to our security, if there's a nuclear war, the bombs are not just going to fall on the Republicans or the Democrats, right? It's going to be a threat against America. And I'm very proud of the fact that on the back of my book, I have 4 former secretaries of state that blurb the book, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. By the way, 3 women and 1 man. And because that's, we need to get back to a more bipartisan way of thinking about national security. On my partisanship, though, let me just reveal something. I've only voted for a Republican once. I'll name him. His name's Pat Shannon. He ran for California Senate, and I knew he was going to lose by a 2-to-1 margin. He's a very good friend of mine. So for the rest of my days, I could say, Pat, I voted for you. But I do, I am a member of the Hoover Institution, right? Not very many Obama people there. In fact, there's just one, me. But I do believe that on the issues I talk about, it's more about national security, not Republican security or Democrat security. Hard to do these days, but I'm trying.
So we're fast forwarding to 2007, I think.
Okay.
When Tony Lake, a former national security advisor, contacted
somebody you know, yes,
and asked you to advise candidate Obama.
Yes.
Why did you decide to do that? Why did you decide to take a flyer on this unlikely candidate? And tell us about how that worked.
Well, Tony did call me first, and I had met him back when you were in the government in the first term of the Clinton administration. I had previously worked for another candidate in 2004. I'm even sometimes embarrassed to admit it, but you're asking embarrassing questions. John Edwards, I worked with him, and a good friend of mine. This is a story about relationships, less than and kind of foreign policy ideology. His name's Derek Chalet. He worked with us in the Obama administration later, and he worked in the Clinton. He was a special assistant to Strobe, in fact, in the second term. Strobe Talbot, Deputy Secretary of State. And Tony called me, and I said, well, I already kind of said I would work with Derek, and if you may have forgotten, because most Americans did, but Senator Edwards was a candidate in 2008 for a while, not very long. And Tony said, well, think about it, because I've worked with a lot of smart people. Remember, he'd worked for President Clinton, and this is the most impressive politician I've ever met in my life. And we hung up. 20 minutes later, another friend of mine called, Susan Rice, who I'd gone to school with at Stanford and Oxford, and I've known for almost all of my adult life. We actually bonded, got to know each other through the anti-apartheid movement at Stanford. And Susan's a little more blunt than Tony. And she said, I'm putting together this team. I know you talked to Tony. This guy is going to be the next president of the United States. He is going to be an inspiration to work for. This is 2007, right? I'd never met him. And I kind of wavered about this John Edwards connection, and she uses some language which I can't repeat, not in public anyway. And it was basically, the train's leaving the station, get your ass on board before it leaves. And so I said yes, because I was afraid of Susan. So yes. And that's how I joined up. But you rightly point out, you got to remember back then, most of the Democratic Party elite was working for then Senator Clinton, because they knew her. She was the candidate that was in the lead. For me, it was easy. I was sitting at Stanford. I didn't have a dog in it. I hadn't worked for the Clinton administration. But for somebody like Susan, she'd spent 8 years with the Clinton team. And in those early days, we were a pretty small team. That made it fun. Later, as we won, more and more people would join up. And remember, just another campaign story before we move on. So we're in the trenches talking about why our candidate is better than Senator Clinton, and we eventually win. It took a long time, if you remember. And then we got this email from Chicago saying, in the name of unity, you need to have all of the former Clinton people that want to join your working groups join. And that meant for me inviting on several former ambassadors and assistant secretaries. Richard Holbrooke even joined my team. So that was a weird dynamic, right? These much more senior people, we were then in charge. But then, then we won the election, and we're talking about what jobs we're going to take, and people thinking about they're going to work over at the State Department. And then, surprise, surprise, he names Senator Clinton to be Secretary Clinton, and all those people that had lost suddenly all got jobs at the State Department. Not very many Obama originals worked over there at all.
That's the American
That
system.
is. That's the way it works.
Yeah.
Worked out for me.
Sure.
I'm not complaining. I was at the White House.
So you get to the White House, and you come up with the idea for a reset in America's relations with Russia. Explain how that came about, what it meant, what the main tenets of the reset policy were, and then we'll get to how it worked out.
Yes. Well, let's be clear. The president came up with those ideas. You're just staff, right? So well, actually, maybe I need to own it because it didn't work out. So that it was my fault. But I do remember the first time he started to use that word. After he won election, president-elect, we started working informally as his staff, right? And so he made some phone calls. He called President Medvedev back then. So I remember starting to write the talking points. And then he was on a television program in December, and I wrote the talking points, with lots of other people involved. Dennis McDonough, and I just heard Ben Rhodes is coming next month. Well, Ben was part of that transition team, and he used the word reset. I think it was on 60 Minutes, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember McDonough calling me and say, that word sounds right. Let's use that as the bumper sticker for the policy. Now, and words matter, by the way. Some words stick. Détente stuck. Other words don't stick. And so, but the policy was much more elaborate than just one word. And I think the idea boiled down to a couple of principles. One is, remember, we were at a pretty confrontational moment then. August 2008, the Russians had just invaded Georgia. Pretty tense time. And we come in and we evaluate where we're at. And we explain to President-elect and then President Obama the kind of origins of this confrontation. And he kept asking the question, well, don't Russia have certain interests that overlap with ours? That was always his rhetorical question, right? So don't they want to deny Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon? That was one of the first big projects I worked on back in 2009. The answer to that was yes, Mr. President. What about nuclear weapons? Surely they don't want more nuclear weapons in the world. And he, as you know, is particularly passionate about trying to reduce the number of nuclear weapons in the world. And we said, okay, that's another one. And then defeating terrorists in Afghanistan. And so the idea was, let's engage with the government on what the president called win-win outcomes, no concessions. This notion of concessions, that just doesn't work in diplomacy. It has to be that both sides think they're better off. And at the same time, engage with Russian society. That was dual-track diplomacy. That was part of the reset. And to the best of our ability, although it became difficult, to not link different issue areas, right? So the Jackson-Vanik was linked to our trade. We deliberately, and actually we stole this from George Shultz, it's in his memoirs, deliberately tried to push on these different issue areas without linking them together. Later in the history of the reset, the U.S. Congress decides to link them, not unlike Jackson-Vanik. But that was the core concept. And before we get to the end and why it ended, it ended tragically, I just want to remind people we got a lot of things done. We got some big things done. And as you know, it's really hard to do anything in government, folks. Try it sometime. You got this interagency process, you're fighting within your own building, and then you got to deal, for me, I had to deal with my friends in the Pentagon and my friends in the State Department and to try to come up with a policy. And finally, you have an idea, and then you got to engage the outside world. For me, it was the Russians, right? They get a voice. And yet, and I go through some of it in the book, so I won't rehearse it all right now. We did get some big things done. I mean, 2010, we signed the New START Treaty, reducing by 30% the number of nuclear weapons in the world. That's what I did. What'd you do? Yeah, that's good.
Here.
That's a lot of years blur by at Stanford. I'm not quite sure what I did. 2002, I think I had an article in World Politics, but I can't really remember. But 2010, I remember pretty well. In fact, two great moments in that year. One was flying to Prague to sign the treaty. And the president was in a great mood. We came in, we landed, and Gary Seymour, who I'm sure you know, he said to Gary and I, why don't you guys ride with me in the car? Let's just have a little fun. And we rode up to the castle, and he's smiling, and he really wanted this treaty. And then, we had to get it ratified, and in December that year, we got it ratified. We only got 72 votes, so it wasn't unanimous. But I went over with the vice president that day and watched up in the, what do you call it?
Gallery.
Gallery, yeah. We were all up there watching the votes. I remember Senator McCain came down like this. He had his thumb like this and then went like that, and we lost him. I later saw him for my confirmation hearings and told him that he should have been with us. But by the way, he was always very good to me. Senator McCain has been a fantastic supporter of me personally. But that day we drank champagne in the Oval Office and celebrated that. So there was a period where we got some things done, and it's important to remember that today, because oftentimes people think, well, we've always been in a confrontation with Russia, and that's just not true. It wasn't true in the early years of the Clinton administration, and it wasn't true in the early years of the Obama administration.
A couple other things you got done. The Iranian nuclear deal.
Yes.
We'll get to that in a few minutes. The Northern Distribution Network.
Yes.
And that was very significant because?
Well, that was one of the biggest projects and one of the scariest projects for me when I worked at the White House. So thanks for asking. So NDN, when we came into office in January 2009, over 90% of our supplies went through Pakistan to supplying our soldiers in Afghanistan, right? And we had an idea that we were going to expand the war to sometimes go into Pakistan. But to do so meant we had to reduce our dependency on them, because if 90% of our supplies, they could cut it off, and our soldiers would be stranded. So my job very early on was to build up this thing called the Northern Distribution Network. And that meant like keeping open our air base in Manas in Kyrgyzstan. When President Bakiyev from Kyrgyzstan, February 2009, I think it was, like weeks into the job, I'm just brand new to government, and He flies to Moscow. He was given a $2 billion economic assistance package. And 2 days later, he said he's closing down Manas. And I remember sitting in the Situation Room, and somebody said, like, who's in charge of Central Asia around here? And we hadn't figured out who was in charge of Central Asia at the time. And eventually I volunteered. I said, General Jones, I'll take that assignment on and, keep that base open. And over time, I won't go through all the bits and pieces, but it was a lot of diplomacy, right? Russia first and foremost. Over time, we increased our supplies to around 50%. For the first time, I think since World War II, U.S. soldiers were flying through Russian airspace to go to Kyrgyzstan and then into their forward operating bases in Afghanistan. Strategic partnership. And 2011, as you may remember, that was we had this very dangerous operation to kill Osama bin Laden. That would have never happened had we had the dependencies on Pakistan that we had before. So not very well known, but vital to our national security interests, and could not have been done without Russian cooperation.
So all of this was under Medvedev.
Yes.
And that made this possible.
I think so.
But then things changed.
Yeah, they did.
Well, we'll get back to that too. So 2 or 3 years in your position at the White House, then you're appointed ambassador to Moscow. So by then, the political climate in Russia was starting to change.
Yes.
What was life like for you as the U.S. ambassador in Moscow?
Well, first of all, remember, I was asked to go consider this job early in 2011. And remember, you may not know this, but most academics, right? I'm a professor, and most academics only spend 2 years in the government. Many universities require that you go back after 2 years. I had told my family that's the deal, 2 years. I dragged them to Washington, and it bled into a third year, but we were always going to come back then. And when I told my immediate boss, Tom Donilon, that, he was like, well, how can you leave now? We're like changing history. And right around that time, we got Medvedev, I'm glad you mentioned his name, to sign off on a UN Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force against Libya. Whether that's a good deal, a good thing or bad thing, I have a chapter on it in the book. But that, for U.S.-Russian relations, that was incredible. Soviet Union or Russia, they'd never authorized the use of force against a sovereign country ever. And Tom was like, how can you leave now? And then he went and he called me, a few hours later and said, hey, I talked to the boss. He says, you can't leave. And so that started a negotiation with my family that was ready to leave.
And you had 2 young kids.
I had 2 young sons that were eager to get back to paradise. Washington's great, but that was the deal. I had signed up to that. And that's when this crazy idea of me going to Moscow started to circulate. And eventually I got to yes with my family. But it took some negotiation. So first is the negotiation with my family. Then there's the security clearance. Then there's the U.S. Congress. And like I said, I had lots of support from lots of Republicans, but my boss did not. And Senator Kirk in particular didn't trust Obama on some missile defense issues. And as a result, we had thought we were going to get to Moscow in August, so we gave up our house in Washington, actually to former Foreign Service officers that were coming back, right? We thought, oh, we'll just stay in this Marriott execu-stay for a few weeks, and then we'll get out, by the beginning of school. We got there the end of December. Actually, got there January. So we had some quality time in the Marriott execu-stay with our family in the cramped, small little space. But in between that time, I'm sorry for the long road to that, we had gone from the height of cooperation to a much more confrontational period for 2 reasons. One, Putin had announced that he was running for president. And when I arrived in January, he was running for president, and Medvedev was being sidelined. And that change had a big impact on U.S.-Russian relations. Those 2 guys think about politics in a different way. If Medvedev embraced Obama's win-win way of framing things. In fact, in Prague, when we signed that treaty, at the end of his remarks, in the English, Medvedev said, Barak, this is a win-win for America and Russia, right? Because he was echoing what Obama had said frequently in the negotiations. I've never heard Putin in Russian or English say win-win. I don't think he doesn't think in those terms. He thinks in zero sum, thinks of us as an adversary on a good day and an enemy on a bad day. So that was the first change. And then before I arrived, and I want to emphasize that, before I became ambassador, there was a parliamentary election in December 2011, falsified kind of normal ways, at normal rates, 5 or 6%. We in Washington didn't think much of it, but a lot of Russians thought a lot of it. And with their smartphones and Twitter and Facebook and VKontakte, documented and publicized this falsification, and then came out on the streets to protest this election. And then, as they stayed on the streets, to protest the Putin regime. And the last time you had so many people on the streets of Moscow was 1991, the year the Soviet Union collapsed. And so those two events together created, Putin needed an argument for why these people protesting against him were illegitimate. And he said that we were the ones funding them, America, Obama, and me. And so by the time I arrived, that is the narrative that I arrive into. In fact, even before I had my first day on the job, even because it was Martin Luther King weekend, I remember it vividly. We fly in, we're all excited. We just been through our nomination thing. It's scary but exciting. We move into this fantastic place, Spaso House. Go look it up on the web. You can take a virtual tour. It's a beautiful, beautiful mansion. Our entire house in Palo Alto could fit in the chandelier room of this place. And so we're just kind of like tourists in our own house, bouncing around. And I didn't have to go to work till Tuesday. And that Monday night, on their main television channel controlled by the Kremlin, ran this like 18-minute hit piece saying, McFaul has been sent here to foment revolution. And that narrative was basically the narrative I've lived with for the rest of my time in Moscow. But, you said, what was it like to be ambassador? So that's the high politics. But before I forget, I heard those moans. And there's more to the moans, by the way. That it gets even worse in the book. But being ambassador is great. And I want to just remind you that it's not all dark. So first of all, just the honor to serve the United States of America and Russia, to be your representative there, experience of a lifetime. I just love that. I love that experience of like, in fact, I'll tell you a story. At one point, there were some death threats against me, and there was some demonstrators showing up all the time. It was a pretty chaotic time in the early weeks of pressure on us. And one of my bodyguards said, Mr. Ambassador, I think we should take the flag down on your car so that we could travel around a little more, not being noticed. And I was like, Sergey, come on. We have this giant black Cadillac, 2 giant, beige Suburbans. Not many of those on the streets of Moscow. That's where my bodyguards travel. You think they don't know it's us? We're going to have that flag on there because I love driving around with that flag. And by the way, a lot of Russians love seeing that flag. So one, just that piece was fantastic. But the second thing I want to, and I write about it in the book, but just I want to remind you that you get to do a lot of interesting things as ambassador. Your job is to engage with different parts of Russian society. And I'd lived in Russia many times before, maybe 5 years of my life I'd already lived in Russia. But there were parts of society that I'd never experienced. And as ambassador, I got to experience. So, sitting in the front row of the Bolshoi Theater for Nutcracker. I had never done that before, but I'd done that as ambassador. Meeting members of the business community, people I didn't know well. And then the reverse, right? bringing Americans to Russia that we could feel proud and celebrate. You know, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra came to Moscow when I was ambassador, and you know, standing in front in Tchaikovsky Hall with 2,500 Russians that really know their classical music, by the way. As an American, that was a great experience, and having Herbie Hancock at my house, like that was my job, And I got to invite 600 of my best friends because the ballroom was big enough. I could have 600 friends in my house. Those are good parts of the job as well.
So you arrived to this 18-minute hit piece on
Yes.
you. And as I understand it, you had decided that you were not going to compromise your values in order to, go do your job as ambassador. You were going to continue to talk to people,
Yes.
to promote human rights, to have people-to-people contact, and so on.
Yeah.
So you did that, and the reaction to you turned into even greater harassment
Right.
and dangerous harassment at some points.
Yeah.
So can you describe a little bit of what then transpired? And then we'll get to the next part, which is you stood up to some of that harassment, and
Yeah.
you used Twitter, and you sort of fought back and so on.
Pushback, right.
So
One of the chapters in the book's called Pushback.
yeah,
Yeah.
what
Well,
happened then?
Well, so first of all, I want to be clear on this. It wasn't my values only. It was the Obama administration's values. And that's something people need to remember. Like, you're part of a team, as you know well. You don't get to, like, be a solo artist. And I love being part of a team, by the way. That was one of the greatest things about being in the government. Because as an academic, it's usually just me sitting in front of the computer writing by myself, right? Anya's in the front row here. Sometimes you have fantastic research assistants that help you. But most of the time, you're like working on your own. And being on the team was great. But back in 2009, we made this the policy, that we were going to engage society as well as the state. And it was controversial. I want to make sure everybody understands. Not everybody in the Obama administration thought that was a good idea. But we experimented with it when the president went to Russia in 2009. Imagine I was in charge of that summit. My first flight on Air Force One was an 11-hour flight that I did not sleep I didn't sleep at all, because I was in charge of all these events, scared to death that something might go wrong, and worried precisely about this component, because day one, Obama spent with Medvedev. Day two, he had breakfast with Putin, and the rest of day two, he spent with students, business people, civil society, and opposition leaders. And it went great. And there was no stirrings. There was nothing that, in fact, we couldn't even get the Western press to write about it. It was such a non-event. So that was our policy. And when I arrived as ambassador, that I continued that policy. But the context had changed radically. That's the point I wanted to make. So 2009, we're in the height of the reset. 2012, there's demonstrations on the street. And so what seemed innocent and not very newsworthy in 2009 became major events. And again, instrumentally used by the Putin regime to suggest that we were there to support the opposition. And I want to be clear on this. We did not fund the opposition. We did not do that. But the storyline was too simple, and in part because of part of the history you talked about earlier in my life. Because there was an earlier part of my life that I was in Russia working for an NGO to promote democracy in 1992. I was there. Invited by the Russian government, by the way. Remember, it wasn't meddling in their internal affairs back then. We were rock stars back then. Everybody loved us. And when President Clinton was elected after that, we even became even greater rock stars. Everybody wanted to be affiliated with us. But that background became part of my baggage when I showed up as the U.S. ambassador in 2012.
So you talked back and you started tweeting.
Yes.
How did that go?
Well, this was definitely not my idea. I'd never seen a tweet until I arrived in Moscow. Kind of odd, thinking I lived in Silicon Valley for 30 years. And that I was instructed to do by my new boss then, Secretary Clinton, right? So I'd moved from the White House. The president is always the boss, but now the reporting line, she was in between me and the president. Not really, but in some formal sense. I'm exaggerating. But she said to me very clearly as I was going out, you need to engage with society. And you need to be strong. She said that because it was kind of a tense time. She had just put out a statement in December 2011 criticizing that parliamentary election, and Putin said that was a signal to the opposition. So it was kind of personal for her. And by the way, it did get personal with her and Putin. And he later took his revenge in 2016. These stories are interrelated for sure. But I did that, and it wasn't just Twitter. It was showing up at college campuses and speaking. It was getting on radio shows and television. And my Russian back then was good enough that I could perform. I even did a whole lecture one time, 75 minutes in Russian. And how was it received? It depends on who you're talking to. I became an instant, public figure. I was oftentimes one of the top 10 ranked bloggers in Russia, right? It was Medvedev, Navalny, and me. Like, I was on the list with those guys because it was such a novel thing, right? A U.S. ambassador writing in Russian, and I would engage playfully, right? I was not afraid to joke around a little bit. One of my tutors in this, his name's Alec Ross. He's now running for governor in Maryland, by the way. But Alec, that was his job at the State Department. He told me that if you just tweet out State Department, bulletin statements, you're going to have 5 followers. You gotta engage in a more personal way, and that was a little strange for me at first. I'd been on television, but I'd never been a public figure, right? But over time, I got more comfortable with it, and people loved it, and my numbers went way up. And Russia's a big country, right? You can't go see everybody. But by tweeting, and I only did it at night usually. I was a virtual ambassador at night, but I was a real ambassador during the day. I didn't want to mix those things up. But I could be engaging with a deputy prime minister in one 5-minute moment, and then a high school kid in Vladivostok. And that was revolution. That part was revolutionary.
I'm sure the Putin administration loved that.
And they didn't love it, right? And in fact, I was told by one of his associates, I'm just too public. I'm too open. That's not what ambassadors are supposed to do. That was the message that was sent to me.
Well, let's fast forward. You raised an interesting question that there was perhaps a vendetta by Putin against Secretary Clinton when she ran for president. Did you see any signs of inclination to meddle in American domestic politics while you were still there? What do you think of the current scandal about this?
Yeah. Well, the one thing I did experience in a very personal way was disinformation and fake news. So those are phrases that Americans are now learning to deal with and in some ways those terms are being used in a very negative way, including by our president, to talk about real news. But in 2012, some of it was playful, some of it was not. So some of it was photoshopping my image and making it look like I was handing out money to the opposition. Some of it was recording a speech I gave to the U.S.-Russia Business Council at the Marriott Hotel. You've been reading about hotels can be recorded. Yes, they can. And the Ritz-Carlton, everything there is recorded. And then splicing it in a certain way to make it sound like we were plotting against Putin. The worst by far was early on in my time, in February 2012, a video started circulating that accuse me of being a pedophile. And what do you do with that? Like, how do you respond? You get on Twitter and say, I'm not a pedophile? That's the weird part of disinformation, right? And it just floats out there. It floats in the internet. We got it pulled down from YouTube, by the way, because I had friends who worked at Google. But then it reappeared on other places, and to this day, it floats. And so that part, disinformation, I experienced early on, and that's now what Putin is exporting. He's exporting it about Ukraine, talking about the Nazis that are ruling Ukraine, but he's exporting it here, and you know, pretending to be Americans, to foment, to exacerbate polarization. And I use that word purposely, right? If we weren't polarized, he wouldn't have anything to play with. But then he is, you know, I think deliberately committed to increasing it. And then, of course, you know, in 2016, he had a very clear preference for Trump, the candidate Trump. By the way, very rational. If I were him, I would have wanted Donald Trump to win too, because President Trump said things like, I'm going to lift sanctions. He said NATO is obsolete. He said he would look into recognizing Crimea as part of Russia. And he never said a word about democracy and human rights. Whereas candidate Clinton was the opposite of all those things. So did he have a preference? That didn't surprise me. But back to your question, did it surprise me that they intervened the way they did? It surprised even me. And I remember first hearing about it and talking to some of my friends in the government that then had to make some hard decisions about how much to talk about it. And everybody was shocked. Like how the Clinton campaign was shocked too, and you American people were shocked. And I'll tell you why I know that, because I was involved in talking about it in real time. I write for the Washington Post column, and I devoted my column in August 2016 to talking about this. And I got more hate mail from that column than ever before or after, part from people that supported candidate Trump saying that I was making it all up. But even other people are like, Russia wouldn't do that. Come on. Oh, you're just, you know, this is your problem with Putin from your times as ambassador. You're making this stuff up. Well, now we know that we weren't making it up.
So, taking another angle on that whole situation, a question from the audience. Straight up, given the evidence so far, is Trump being blackmailed by Putin?
I don't know. Straight up, I don't know. And I'm always very careful not to get ahead of my skis. I don't want to say things I don't know. Do I, here, let me tell you what I'm confident in, and then the gray area. I'm confident that Putin wanted Trump to win. I already said that. I think the evidence is overwhelming that he intervened to help him win. Stealing data from the DNC and John Podesta and then publishing it, that was clearly designed to help one candidate and hurt the other. When Sputnik circulates, Sputnik is a Russian government media firm, 100% controlled by the Russian government. When they tweet #CrookedHillary, you don't need a PhD in Russian studies to understand whose side they're on there, okay? Buying ads on Facebook, that happened. That was designed to help one candidate and hurt the other. Meeting with Donald Jr. and the other people to bring compromise with Secretary Clinton, the intention of that was to help Trump win the election. Whether something illegal happened there, that's a different matter. I'm not a lawyer, I can't judge that. But was the intention to help, and the other side was eager to engage in that? I think that is obvious. What I don't know are two things, and that's why we need this investigation to be completed. I don't know if the Russian government has collected compromising material on our president. I know they have the capacity to do that, and I know that hotel well. I write about it in the book. When we stayed in that hotel, the Ritz-Carlton, where President Trump he wasn't candidate then, businessman Trump stayed in 2013. I was ambassador when he came to town, by the way. In order for us to have a confidential conversation with President Obama, we built this submarine-like structure Maybe you remember it from your time in the government.
I've been in similar ones.
Yes, yeah, and this is the first time I'd seen this thing. I mean, every piece was shipped from Washington, built inside a suite in the Ritz-Carlton. And I remember I just saw my old friend David Axelrod last week, and we were remembering this trip. You know, he's a tall guy, and he had to like scrunch down into this submarine. So those are the lengths one goes to not be recorded in that place. Did they record anything? I don't know that. And then the other piece, I know the way Putin nurtures leverage with other politicians and business people in Russia and in Europe using money. It's a tactic he uses all the time. You know, certain terms are given to you, but that then makes you beholden to me, right? That is a very common tactic. I do not know if that tactic was used in the relationship with Trump or the people around him.
So there's a group of questions under the general rubric of Wither Russia. Let me go through a few of them. Is public support of Putin waning? Do citizens want change? Reports of protests by young people. How will Putin choose his successor?
Yeah.
What or who comes after Putin?
Oh, too many hard questions, folks.
Okay, well, we'll stop there.
Those are hard questions. And I'm going to answer them, but I'm going to caveat by saying political science, we're really bad at predicting political change in the future. And now I've been in the government for 5 years. So is the intelligence community. You know, did we get the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009 right? No. Did we get the Arab Spring right in 2011? No. Did we get Russia in 2011 right? No. Did we get Ukraine right in 2013? So just, we need to be humble about our predictions about what might happen in the future, right? But I'm going to guess anyway, because you asked. Here's a couple of things I would say. Is Putin's support waning? I think the survey data for that suggests yes, but slowly. Back in 2012, he was at the lowest point he'd ever been. It's important to remember that. That's why he was so panicked. And I think their internal polling was even worse than what was public. It was only the rallying around the flag effect of the war that they have with us. You may not know this, but we were in a war with Russia over Ukraine in 2014. That's the way it's described to Russians on television. And all countries, I don't care, Americans, Iranians, Russians, when you're at war, we rally around the flag. And don't forget that 75% of Americans supported George W. Bush when he went into Iraq. 75% of us were supporting him. So that effect has happened. But it's beginning to fade because people don't really understand what the payoff is, and the economy is not doing as well as people would hope. So that's happening. That's number one. Number two, remember what I just told you about monitoring in this society. When I was ambassador, I assumed that every phone call I made, every email I sent, every movement I made in my own house was recorded. We lived downtown in Spaso House, and one of the most expensive cities in the world. And around us were these apartment buildings. And they all had for rent signs in them. And nobody ever moved in. Think about that. All looking down on us. Nobody ever moved in. And I think you would be shocked if you understood fully the abilities of countries like Russia to monitor these kinds of things. I most certainly was when I first was briefed on it. I can't talk about it. But I tell you that because most Russians know that as well. So think about this. You're sitting in Novosibirsk, minding your own business, and your phone rings. And it's, Mr. Plekhanov from Moscow at a polling firm. And he says to you, and by the way, there's only one quasi-independent polling firm. All the rest are controlled by the state. And he says to you, what do you think of Putin? There's only one rational answer to that question, right?
Whoa.
There's no...
Great guy.
Yeah, why would you say anything else? You know, your phone's tapped. They know who you are. It's from Moscow in a highly suspicious society. So I think those opinion polls are also inflated, which is not to say that he doesn't have support. He won the election with a lot of support. But then there's one other thing you need to remember about that support. And actually, Obama used to complain about this all the time. When he would read, he always read Putin's approval ratings versus his, and Putin was always ahead. By the way, there was one time in 2010 that President Obama was more popular in Russia than he was here. He was like 58% there. He was at 42 here. But he was always, Obama's a super competitive guy. And he would look at those numbers and he said, well, I could be at 70% too if I controlled all the television stations and the Congress was totally beholden to me. And every NGO had to support me or I would arrest them, right? So, and the competition. Remember who Putin ran against. It's like my son's 9th grade basketball team playing the Warriors. It looks like a basketball game, and formally there's 2 teams, but come on, it's not real competition. Like, what kind of victory is that? So remember all that when you hear about how popular Putin is.
Going forward in policy with Russia, towards the end of your government service, you had rethought the reset. You were talking about selective containment and selective engagement.
Yeah.
Somebody from the audience says, reset was a total failure. Where do we go from here? So, we have a president, he has policy, but in the ideal world, what would you suggest as U.S. policy towards Russia?
Well, first of all, I want to make sure you understand that I don't believe reset was a failure. Buy the book and then write back to me, mcfall@stanford.edu, whoever said that, write back to me your comments about it. Because I think there's a misconception about the reset that I want to spend 2 minutes on because I think it suggests what we should do in the future. The goal of the reset was never better relations with Russia. That's a giant misnomer. In fact, it's something that President Trump is confused about. The goal should never be better relations with country X, Y, and Z. Even France, that should not be the goal. The goal should be what is in the interests of the American people? What is in our security interests, our welfare interests, our values? That's how you define a policy. You sit in the Situation Room and you say, these are the things we need to get done. And then you devise a strategy to achieve it. And sometimes that strategy is engagement, as it was during the reset. Other times it's pushback, it's containment. And then sometimes it's isolation, it's indifference, like don't chase the Russians around all the time. And so in those first years of the reset, we had very concrete goals we wanted to get done. We wanted to get the START treaty done. We got that done. We wanted to get sanctions on Iran. We got that done. We wanted to reduce our dependencies on Pakistan. We got that done. We wanted Russia into the WTO. We thought that was good for the world economic community. We got that done. And if you didn't want to do the reset, then you have to take all those things off the table. We don't kill Osama bin Laden. We don't get the Iran nuclear deal. We don't have a new arms control treaty. And by the way, the arms control treaty, I was part of that negotiating team. For me, the verification measures, I used to say, Reagan said, trust but verify. I used to say, don't trust, only verify. We don't need to be friends, but we do need to have a verification regime in place. So if you don't do the reset, all of those things get taken off the table. The world looks different. And then when Putin comes in and doesn't want to cooperate, well, what can you do? It takes 2 to tango. And then you have to adjust your policy. And I think that's the tragic lesson for today. The number of issue areas where we can cooperate, I think, are smaller today than they were in 2009. And so mostly we have to contain what I would call negative behavior in the world by Putin. So like in Ukraine, I was just in Ukraine a few weeks ago. I think that is critical that we dig in and do all we can to help democracy and economic growth dig in there. And, in other places around the world, we have to be confrontational with Russia in order to check negative behavior. But when pockets of cooperation are available, even with Putin today, we should engage on that. And for me, for instance, I think arms control is one of those. We have thankfully ended the quantitative nuclear arms race of the Cold War. And, we brought it down to 1550. That's the number of nuclear weapons are allowed under the START Treaty. But now we're in a qualitative phase where the delivery vehicles are scary. And what Putin announced in March are very scary and not under the START Treaty. That torpedo that he announced, go look it up. I'm very familiar with that weapon. And it is a long-range torpedo armed with a nuclear warhead designed to do just one thing, to attack large communities on coasts. I know where we're located here. I was just looking out at the water. That's what that weapon is designed to do, folks. We need to deal with that in an arms control regime, irrespective of what you think about Putin and other issue areas.
He's out to get our coast just like our president. Couple quick ones, not related to Russia.
Okay.
Is there any way Trump can make the negotiations work out well in North Korea, if he in fact goes?
I think the probabilities are low. I want to be honest with you. And, I have a lot of colleagues of mine at Stanford that work more closely than I do on this issue, but I think they're very low. I don't see a scenario where we get a deal as good as the one that he just ripped up with Iran. I don't see that happening with the North Koreans. And at the same time, as I've said publicly before and written, if he achieves it, I'll be the first one to applaud it. So I think it's a very low probability. I think there's real downside by his strategy. If it were us, we would have worked up to a presidential summit, not start with the presidential summit. And you would have, in fact, we had it when President Obama went to Moscow for the first time in July 2009. He signed at that meeting a framework agreement for the New START Treaty. We had done all the work before we got there. Your friend Rose Gottemoeller, in fact, we were just talking about her. She did a lot of the heavy lifting to get to that framework agreement so that they just weren't sitting down and getting to know each other. So that would have been my preferred way of doing it because, you're giving a lot to Kim Jong-un by just sitting down with them, giving them a lot of international respectability. But, they've chosen a different course. I hope they have a strategy for getting there. I'm not convinced they do. But all the other strategies have failed, so I'm willing to give it a chance.
So it's time for our last question. I'd love to continue this for a longer time. Montana, Stanford, England, Stanford, Washington, Moscow, 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 Moscow.
You're leaving out Zimbabwe. I went there a few times, summers. Let's not go there.
That someday. I went there as well. What's next? Will you be an academic? Will there be another round for you in government?
Who knows? I mean, it was an accident of history that I had the incredible honor to serve President Obama. I just saw him a few weeks ago, gave him a copy of my book, and kind of went on this nostalgia tour, right? Seeing people who I had worked with, and if you ever get that chance, you should take it. And they are chance, right? They come along and it happens and may not happen again. I don't know. I do know I will be at Stanford for the rest of my life for sure. Who would ever give up tenure at Stanford? I'm smart enough to never do that. I'd love Stanford. I went there as a 17-year-old kid. I've gone away 7 times, but I've come back 8 times. Stanford will always be my base. Whether there's an opportunity to do other things, we'll see. But I like being in between. We were talking about earlier. I like thinking analytically, but also being involved in policy. And this book, you know, I've never written a book where I use the word I before. This is the first time I've ever written a book where I use that word. But I liked it because it's in a way, it's a reflection of who I am, both trying to do things in the world when I get the chance, but also thinking about it analytically. And that Stanford gives me the privilege to do that. I'll be forever grateful.
You've gone into some challenging situations, so I think we all owe you a thanks for your service.
Well, thank you, and thanks for coming tonight. Thank you.
Our thanks to Ambassador.
Thank you.
Our thanks to Ambassador Mike McFaul, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, director of the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford, author of the new book, From Cold War to Hot Peace. This program has been part of the Commonwealth Club's Good Lit series, underwritten by the Bernard Osher Foundation. Ambassador McFaul will be signing his book afterwards, which I have read and is full of great stories, outside in just a minute, so make sure you pick up a copy as you leave. I'm Gloria Duffy. Thank you for joining us this evening at the Commonwealth Club.
Thank you.